August 30, 1944, 3rd Army Headquarters, Chalon-sur-Marne, France. Major General George S. Patton, Jr. stood before a wall-sized map of France, his face showing an expression rarely seen by his staff officers. Frustration bordering on desperation. His right hand traced the distance from his current position to the German frontier, a mere 80 miles. Beyond that, the Rhine River. Beyond that, the industrial heartland of Nazi Germany. His Third Army had covered more than 400 miles in 26 days, liberating dozens of French towns, destroying German units at every turn, and threatening to end the European war before Christmas. "We have no gas," he said quietly to his operations officer. "Not enough to move forward. Not enough to even patrol aggressively. The greatest army in American history is going to stop not because of German resistance, but because we cannot fill our fuel tanks." The map on Patton's wall told a story that few civilians would ever fully understand. The colored pins marking his forward units stretched in a vast arc across eastern France. Behind them, supply dumps were represented by different colored markers. The gap between combat formations and supply sources now exceeded 450 miles. Between those positions lay roads damaged by years of war, bridges destroyed by Allied bombing, railway lines rendered useless by systematic interdiction, and a transportation network struggling to move 60,000 tons of supplies per day across terrain that had seen more destruction in 4 years than in the previous 4 centuries. What Patton could not see on his map, what even his logistics officers struggled to fully comprehend, was the absolutely staggering scale of the supply operation attempting to sustain his advance. At that very moment, nearly 6,000 trucks were driving in continuous loops from the beaches of Normandy to forward supply dumps, covering distances that would have taken medieval armies months to traverse. These trucks, part of what would become known as the Red Ball Express, were consuming thousands of gallons of fuel to deliver fuel to the front lines, a mathematical paradox that threatened to collapse the entire supply system. Behind those trucks, in the ports and on the beaches of Normandy, cargo ships were being unloaded at rates that would have seemed miraculous just months earlier. Artificial harbors constructed from sunken ships and massive concrete caissons were handling cargo volumes that rivaled major commercial ports. Railway crews were working around the clock to repair tracks, bridges, and rolling stock destroyed by the very Allied air forces that now depended on ground transportation. And further back, across the English Channel, in Britain and North America, factories were producing millions of tons of supplies. Ships were being loaded for the Atlantic crossing, and a logistics pipeline stretching 3,000 miles from American manufacturing centers to French battlefields was attempting to sustain a military force of unprecedented size and complexity. This is not a story you have heard before. The history books tell you about D-Day, about the breakout from Normandy, about the liberation of Paris, about the Battle of the Bulge and the crossing of the Rhine. They tell you about Eisenhower's strategic decisions, Patton's aggressive tactics, and Montgomery's methodical advance. They tell you about the brave soldiers who stormed beaches, fought in hedgerows, and pushed into Germany itself. What they rarely tell you about is the vast, complex, absolutely critical logistics operation that made every single one of those events possible. Without this logistics miracle, D-Day would have been a disaster. The breakout from Normandy would have failed. The advance to Germany would have been impossible. Victory would have been unachievable. Today, we are going to explore every aspect of this logistics miracle. We will examine the artificial harbors that made the initial landings possible. We will follow the truck convoys that raced across France. We will document the railway repair efforts that restored a shattered transportation network. We will analyze the decisions that determined who got supplies and who did not. We will explore how the Allies solved problems that military theorists had considered unsolvable. This is the story of how World War II was won not with courage alone, but with trucks, trains, tires, fuel, ammunition, food, and an absolutely unprecedented level of organization and planning. This is the story of the greatest logistics achievement in military history. This is the hidden miracle that turned the tide of the war. To understand the magnitude of what the Allies accomplished, we must first understand the fundamental problem they faced. This was not simply a matter of delivering supplies. Every military force in history had faced that challenge. What made the Northwest Europe campaign different was the scale, the speed, and the complexity of the logistics requirement. Consider the basic mathematics. When Allied forces landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, they brought with them detailed studies of supply requirements compiled by logistics officers who had spent years analyzing data from previous campaigns. These studies revealed a number that would haunt every supply officer from D-Day to V-Day. Each American soldier fighting in Northwest Europe required approximately 66.8 pounds of supplies per day. That figure deserves detailed examination because most people have no real conception of what it means. This was not the weight of personal equipment the soldier carried. This was the daily consumption of everything needed to keep that soldier combat effective. Let us break it down by category. Food and water accounted for approximately 10 pounds per soldier per day. The standard American field ration consisted of 3 main meals, supplemented by emergency rations, coffee, sugar, and water purification supplies. In the European theater, water was generally available from local sources, but in forward areas or during rapid advances, water had to be transported in tanker trucks. Each soldier consumed roughly 1 gallon of water per day for drinking and minimal hygiene, weighing 8.34 pounds. Food added another 1.5 pounds. Ammunition requirements varied dramatically based on the tactical situation, but planning figures assumed each rifleman would fire approximately 10 rounds per day in sustained operations. That sounds minimal until you multiply it across an entire division and add the ammunition consumed by machine guns, mortar, artillery, and anti-aircraft weapons. An infantry division of approximately 14,000 men typically consumed 200 tons of ammunition per day during active operations. That works out to roughly 29 pounds per soldier when averaged across the entire force. Fuel represented one of the largest supply categories. While individual infantrymen did not personally consume fuel, the vehicles that transported them, supported them, and enabled their mobility required enormous quantities. A single infantry division required approximately 40,000 gallons of gasoline per day to operate its trucks, jeeps, and other vehicles. An armored division, with its tanks and half-tracks, consumed up to 60,000 gallons per day. When these figures are averaged across an entire army including support troops, the per-soldier fuel requirement approached 15 pounds per day. Medical supplies, while not heavy in absolute terms, required constant replenishment. Bandages, plasma, morphine, sulfa drugs, and surgical supplies had to be available at every echelon from battalion aid stations to field hospitals. Clothing and equipment replacement added several pounds per soldier per day to account for worn-out uniforms, damaged boots, and lost personal gear. Then came the categories that civilians never consider. Replacement parts for thousands of vehicles and hundreds of thousands of individual weapons. Lubricants for machinery operating in dusty conditions, batteries for radios, maps and documents. Signal equipment, engineering supplies, maintenance tools. The list extended for pages in official planning documents. And finally, morale supplies. Cigarettes were issued as standard rations, 4 packs per week for each soldier. Mail from home had to be transported to forward areas. Recreation supplies, from playing cards to athletic equipment, were considered essential for maintaining fighting efficiency during periods out of the line. The 66.8-pound daily requirement represented an average calculated across all soldiers in theater, including both combat and support troops. Combat units consumed more than this average, particularly ammunition and medical supplies. Support units consumed less, but they required different supplies like spare parts, construction materials, and office supplies. Now multiply 66.8 pounds by the number of soldiers in theater. On D-Day plus 30, approximately 1 million Allied soldiers were operating in Normandy. 1 million soldiers times 66.8 pounds equals 66,800,000 pounds per day. That is 33,400 tons per day, every single day. By September 1944, when Patton ran out of gas, there were over 2 million Allied soldiers in France, Belgium, and Holland. 2 million soldiers times 66.8 pounds equals 133,600,000 pounds per day. That is 66,800 tons per day, every single day. To visualize this scale, imagine loading modern 18-wheel semi-trucks. Each truck can carry approximately 50,000 pounds of cargo. To move 66,800 tons would require 2,672 fully loaded trucks every single day. That convoy, if traveling bumper to bumper, would stretch over 30 miles. But the Allies were not using modern semi-trucks. They were using GMC 2.5-ton trucks, which could carry 5,000 pounds when fully loaded over European roads. That meant moving 66,800 tons required 26,720 truck trips per day. If each truck made one round trip every 2 days, covering 800 miles round trip, the supply system needed approximately 53,440 trucks in continuous operation. The actual numbers were even worse because armies do not remain stationary. They advance. When Patton's Third Army was racing across France in August 1944, his forward elements were moving 50 to 60 miles per day. That meant supply dumps established today were 50 miles behind the front lines tomorrow. Trucks that could make the round trip to forward positions, in one day, when the front was 200 miles from the beaches, found themselves driving for 2 or 3 days when the front reached 400 miles from the beaches. The supply line stretched like a rubber band, being pulled tighter and tighter. Every mile the army advanced added to the distance supplies had to travel. Every additional mile meant more trucks, more fuel consumed in transportation, more time in transit, and more opportunities for mechanical failure, enemy action, or simple traffic congestion to interrupt the flow. And this rubber band was being stretched across a country whose infrastructure had been systematically destroyed. The Allied strategic bombing campaign preceding D-Day had been extraordinarily successful in its primary objective, preventing German reinforcements from reaching Normandy. Transportation Plan, as it was called, targeted French railways, bridges, marshalling yards, and road junctions. Allied bombers flew thousands of sorties against these targets in the months before the invasion. They destroyed rail bridges across every major river in northern France. They cratered railway yards from Paris to the coast. They demolished repair facilities and destroyed rolling stock. The results were exactly as intended. German reinforcements moving to Normandy had to travel by road because the railways were unusable. Panzer divisions that should have reached the invasion beaches in days took weeks instead. The tactical success was undeniable. The strategic consequence was that when Allied forces broke out of Normandy and began their rapid advance, they were moving through a country where almost nothing worked. The deep water ports that could efficiently handle cargo ships were either still in German hands or had been thoroughly demolished before capture. The railways that could have moved supplies efficiently were inoperable. The bridges that would have carried truck traffic had been destroyed. Even many roads were damaged by years of military traffic and poor maintenance. Consider the port situation specifically. In normal commercial operations, cargo from America to Europe would arrive at major ports like Le Havre, Cherbourg, or Antwerp. These ports had the deep water berths necessary to accommodate large cargo vessels, the cranes and stevedore facilities to unload them efficiently, the warehousing to store cargo temporarily, and the rail connections to move goods inland. All of these ports were either in German hands or destroyed. Le Havre, the second largest port in France, was not captured until September 12, 1944. When Allied forces finally took it, they found the harbor completely blocked by sunken ships and the port facilities demolished. It would take months to clear. Cherbourg, captured on June 27 after heavy fighting, was perhaps the single most thoroughly destroyed port in military history. The German commander, General Karl Wilhelm von Schlieffen, had received explicit orders from Hitler himself to destroy the port completely before surrendering. Von Schlieffen followed these orders meticulously. His engineers blocked the harbor entrance with sunken ships. They destroyed all the cranes. They demolished the power station. They wrecked the lock gates that controlled water levels in the inner harbor. They placed demolition charges in the quay walls. They contaminated the water supply. They booby-trapped buildings throughout the port facility. When American forces finally cleared Cherbourg, they found a port that was essentially non-functional. The U.S. Navy's underwater demolition teams spent weeks clearing the harbor of obstacles. Army engineers worked around the clock repairing facilities. Specialized equipment had to be brought from America to replace destroyed French equipment. The first Liberty ship did not berth in Cherbourg until July 16, nearly 3 weeks after the port's capture. Even then, cargo handling capacity was a fraction of the port's pre-war capability. Antwerp, the largest port in Belgium and the third largest in Europe, would not be available until November 28, 1944, nearly 6 months after D-Day. Its story deserves separate examination because it illustrates how military, operations and logistics planning become inseparably linked. With the major ports unavailable or destroyed, the Allies had to rely on two methods for getting supplies ashore: artificial harbors and direct beach unloading. Both represented significant engineering challenges and operational limitations. Before examining how supplies actually moved, we must understand what the planners intended. The logistics plan for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Northwest Europe, was developed over 18 months by staff officers in both Britain and America. These officers wrestled with problems that had no historical precedent. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Rinning of the Transportation Corps led the American logistics planning effort. His staff included railway experts, truck fleet managers, port operations specialists, and petroleum engineers. British counterparts under Major General Miles Graham worked in parallel, with both groups coordinating through Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. The planners started with the requirement: move millions of tons of supplies from ports and beaches to armies that would advance from Normandy to Germany. They worked backwards from this requirement, calculating what would be needed at each stage. Their analysis filled hundreds of pages of documents that remained classified until the 1970s. The plan divided logistics operations into phases corresponding to the expected advance. Phase 1 covered the initial landing and beachhead consolidation, expected to last approximately 3 weeks. During this phase, supplies would come directly across the beaches with minimal intermediate handling. Units would maintain reduced supply levels, carrying only combat essential items. Planning assumed 15 pounds per man per day during this initial phase, less than 1/4 the eventual requirement, because tactical urgency outweighed logistical sustainability. Phase 2 would begin once the beachhead was secured and ports became available. This phase assumed capture of Cherbourg and establishment of the Mulberry harbors. Supply rates would increase to 30 pounds per man per day as units built stockpiles and prepared for the breakout. This phase was expected to last through July and into early August. Phase 3 covered the advance from Normandy to the Seine River and Paris. Planning assumed this advance would take most of August. Supplies would flow through Cherbourg and the Mulberry harbors to dumps established inland, then forward to the armies by truck and, if possible, by rail. The supply requirement would reach 50 pounds per man per day as offensive operations intensified. Phase 4 assumed the advance from the Seine to the German frontier, expected to take all of September and October. By this point, planners hoped to have captured additional ports in Brittany and possibly Le Havre. The supply requirement would reach full operational levels of 66.8 pounds per man per day. Rail transportation would become increasingly important as the distance from beaches to front lines exceeded economical truck ranges. Phase 5 covered operations in Germany itself. Planning for this phase was necessarily vague because so much depended on tactical developments. The planners assumed that captured German infrastructure would supplement Allied logistics, that the pace of advance would slow due to expected German resistance, and that supply requirements would remain at full operational levels. This phased approach seemed logical on paper. In reality, Phase 3 occurred twice as fast as planned. Phase 4 never stabilized, and the entire logistics system nearly collapsed under the strain. The transportation plan was built around 3 primary modes: sea, truck, and rail. Each had specific roles based on distance and volume. Ships would move supplies from America and Britain to French ports and beaches. Trucks would move supplies from ports to forward dumps, typically distances under 200 miles. Railways would move supplies from ports to intermediate dumps for distances over 200 miles, eventually taking over most long-distance transportation. The truck fleet deserved enormous attention during planning. Planners calculated that maintaining 2 million soldiers at distances up to 400 miles from the beaches would require approximately 60,000 trucks operating continuously. These trucks would be organized into transportation corps truck companies, each containing 48 vehicles with assigned drivers and maintenance personnel. The GMCCCKW 2.5-ton truck was selected as the standard cargo vehicle. This choice reflected extensive analysis of vehicle performance, maintenance requirements, and manufacturing capacity. The GMC offered proven reliability, adequate cross-country capability, and could be manufactured in large numbers at General Motors facilities. Over 562,000 GM-CCKW trucks were produced during the war, with approximately 40,000 committed to the European theater. Each truck could carry 5,000 pounds of cargo on improved roads. This capacity decreased to approximately 4,000 pounds on secondary roads and 3,000 pounds on damaged roads, which would be most of what the drivers encountered. Planning assumed each truck would average 25 miles per hour when loaded, slower than the vehicle's maximum speed due to convoy operations, road congestion, and routing through damaged areas. Fuel consumption was calculated at approximately 6 miles per gallon when loaded. This meant a truck consuming 133 gallons on an 800-mile round trip to deliver 5,000 pounds of cargo, equivalent to 625 gallons when you account for the weight of the fuel itself. The mathematics was concerning. Delivering fuel consumed enormous quantities of the very commodity being delivered. At distances over 400 miles, trucks consumed more fuel in transportation than they delivered to the front lines, creating an unsustainable situation. The planners recognized this limitation and emphasized railway rehabilitation as the long-term solution. Railways could move vastly more cargo per gallon of fuel consumed. A single freight train could carry the equivalent of 100 trucks while consuming perhaps 1/10 the fuel per ton-mile. The Railway Rehabilitation Plan identified priority routes connecting ports to likely forward areas. Engineers would repair these routes first, focusing on restoring through capacity rather than achieving pre-war standards. Bridges would be rebuilt as quickly as possible using temporary spans where necessary. Track repairs would focus on main lines, leaving branch lines for later phases. Rolling stock would be assembled from surviving French equipment supplemented by American and British locomotives and cars shipped from overseas. Railway operating personnel posed a unique challenge. The U.S. Army's Military Railway Service had approximately 40,000 troops trained in railway operations, including engineers, train crews, maintenance personnel, and traffic controllers. But this force had to operate railways across multiple theaters while also training additional personnel. French railway workers, if they could be recruited and organized, would be essential to making the system work. The Petroleum Supply Plan recognized that fuel would be the most critical commodity. Combat vehicles, particularly tanks, consumed fuel at prodigious rates. A single M4 Sherman tank consumed approximately 1 gallon for every 2 miles traveled. An armored division with over 250 tanks could consume 30,000 gallons per day, just moving to a new position before engaging in any combat operations. Petroleum products had to be transported in dedicated tanker trucks or loaded into jerrycans for distribution. The planners calculated that 10% of all truck capacity would be dedicated to fuel transportation, with higher percentages as distances increased. Underground pipelines from the beaches to forward areas were proposed, but would take months to construct. Ammunition planning was complicated by the variety of munitions types and the unpredictability of consumption. An infantry division carried 1,500 different items in its ammunition inventory, from .30 caliber rifle cartridges to 105 mm howitzer shells. Each type had different storage requirements, handling procedures, and distribution channels. Planning assumed 3 levels of ammunition supply. Basic load was carried by each unit in its own vehicles, sufficient for several days of combat. Combat load was stored at division and corps dumps, sufficient for 2 weeks of intense operations. Reserve stocks remained at Army-level dumps, providing surge capacity for unexpected situations. The weight and bulk of ammunition created particular challenges. Small arms ammunition was relatively dense and could be efficiently packed. Artillery shells were heavy, bulky, and required careful handling to prevent accidents. Mines and explosives had to be segregated from other supplies. The planners allocated thousands of trucks specifically for ammunition distribution. Medical supply planning had to account for expected casualty rates and the types of injuries likely in different types of combat. Whole blood could not be stored indefinitely, requiring continuous shipment from America and Britain. Plasma, sulfa drugs, morphine, and surgical equipment had to be distributed through specialized medical supply companies to hospitals at various echelons. Spare parts and maintenance supplies received extensive attention because equipment failures could disable the logistics system itself. Every truck required regular maintenance. Tires wore out rapidly on rough roads. Engines required oil changes. Transmissions failed. Planning allocated 10% of total shipping capacity to spare parts and maintenance supplies, ensuring damaged vehicles could be repaired rather than abandoned. The intangible elements of the plan were equally important. The planners established priorities, determining which supplies moved first when capacity was insufficient for everything. Generally, ammunition took priority over fuel, fuel over food, food over other items. But these priorities could be adjusted based on tactical situations. Before a major offensive, ammunition might take absolute priority. During a static period, fuel for truck convoys might become the critical item. Communications and coordination procedures were established to track supplies from ports to frontline units. Each supply item would be documented, loaded onto transportation assets with manifests, tracked through intermediate dumps, and receipted at final delivery. The paperwork system was designed to prevent supplies from being lost, misdirected, or forgotten in the vast pipeline. Training exercises in Britain tested these procedures before D-Day. Entire units practiced loading ships, crossing to designated beaches, unloading, and moving inland. The exercises revealed numerous problems that were corrected before the actual invasion. Loading plans were refined. Manifesting procedures were simplified. Dump layouts were standardized. But no amount of planning could fully prepare for the reality that would unfold after D-Day. The armies would advance faster than planned. Ports would take longer to open than expected. The enemy would fight harder in some areas and collapse faster in others. And the logistics system would be tested beyond anything the planners had imagined possible. The name entered military legend as a symbol of determination, improvisation, and the extraordinary performance of soldiers who drove trucks instead of firing rifles. The Red Ball Express, officially the Red Ball Motor Transport, operated from August 25 to November 16, 1944, moving supplies from Normandy beaches to forward areas at the peak of the advance across France. The name derived from railroad terminology. American railroads used red balls painted on freight cars to designate express shipments that received priority over all other traffic. The Transportation Corps adopted this term for truck routes that would receive similar priority status. Only supply trucks were allowed on red ball routes. All other traffic, including troop convoys, staff cars, and even tanks, had to use alternate roads. The system came into existence not because of planning but because of crisis. In late August 1944, the logistics situation approached catastrophe. Patton's Third Army had advanced 400 miles from Normandy in less than 4 weeks. The First Army had liberated Paris on August 25. British and Canadian forces were advancing toward Belgium. The German army appeared to be collapsing. But the supply system was failing. Cherbourg, still the only major port operating, was 450 miles from Patton's forward units. The trucks hauling supplies to the front were consuming enormous quantities of fuel just to make the journey. Many were breaking down from the strain of continuous operations. The backlog of supplies waiting at the beaches was growing because not enough trucks were available to move everything forward. Colonel John C. Eisenhower, son of the Supreme Commander and himself a logistics officer, later wrote that the period from late August to mid-September 1944 represented the closest the Allied logistics system came to complete collapse during the entire Northwest Europe campaign. Armies were advancing without adequate fuel or ammunition. Commanders were rationing supplies at every level. And no solution seemed immediately available. The Red Ball Express was improvised in response to this crisis. On August 25, the Transportation Corps established 2 one-way loops connecting the Normandy beaches to forward supply dumps. The northern loop ran through Alençon, and the southern loop through Le Mans. Trucks would drive loaded to the forward dumps, unload, then return empty via parallel routes. Traffic would move continuously, 24 hours per day, 7 days a week. The routes were marked with red balls painted on signs every few miles. Military police were stationed at every intersection to ensure only authorized traffic used the routes. Maintenance crews were positioned at intervals to provide emergency repairs. Fuel points allowed trucks to refill without leaving the main route. Medical stations treated drivers injured in accidents. The truck companies assigned to Red Ball came primarily from Transportation Corps battalions, many of which were segregated African American units. The 3,638th, 3,639th, 3,640th, and 3,641st Quartermaster Truck Companies formed the initial contingent. These companies had been training in Britain for months, expecting to perform routine supply missions. Instead, they found themselves driving the most demanding logistics operation of the war. The drivers faced conditions that tested endurance and skill. A typical Red Ball run covered 650 to 800 miles round trip. Drivers were expected to complete this in 48 hours, allowing 24 hours for the journey to the forward dump, several hours for unloading and rest, then 24 hours for the return trip. In practice, many drivers made the round trip in 36 hours or less, sleeping only when their convoy stopped for fuel, or when exhaustion made further driving impossible. The roads themselves were challenging. French roads in 1944 were not designed for heavy military traffic. Most were narrow, with soft shoulders that could not support a loaded truck that veered off the pavement. Road surfaces, already damaged by years of war, deteriorated rapidly under the pounding of tens of thousands of heavily loaded trucks. Dust in dry weather reduced visibility to yards. Rain turned unsurfaced roads into muddy tracks. Accidents were inevitable. Drivers fighting exhaustion sometimes fell asleep at the wheel. Trucks collided with each other in the dark because blackout conditions prevented use of full headlights. Vehicles skidded on rain-slick roads. Tires blew out at speed. Mechanical failures caused vehicles to stop suddenly in traffic. The Transportation Corps estimated that approximately 1 in every 50 trucks on Red Ball routes suffered some form of accident or breakdown during each run. Maintenance became a constant challenge. The GMC trucks were reliable by 1940 standards, but continuous operation at maximum loads over bad roads pushed them beyond their design parameters. Engines overheated in the summer heat. Cooling systems failed from accumulated dust. Transmissions wore out from constant shifting on hilly terrain. Brake linings burned up from repeated applications on long descents. Tires were perhaps the single most critical maintenance issue. Each truck had 6 tires, 2 on the front axle and 4 on the rear dual wheels. These tires were designed for approximately 10,000 miles of normal use. On Red Ball routes, tires might last 2,000 miles before wearing through or suffering damage from road debris. With thousands of trucks operating continuously, tire consumption reached catastrophic levels. The Transportation Corps established tire exchange points along the routes where drivers could get replacements without waiting for full maintenance. Crews would remove the worn tire and mount a recapped or new one in minutes, allowing the truck to continue. The removed tires went to recapping facilities where workers added new tread material to the casing. Many tires were recapped multiple times before the casing finally failed. Fuel consumption by the Red Ball fleet itself became a significant concern. Each loaded truck consumed approximately 133 gallons on a round trip of 800 miles. With 6,000 trucks operating at peak periods, the Red Ball fleet was consuming nearly 800,000 gallons per day just to operate. This fuel had to be diverted from combat units, creating difficult priority decisions. The drivers themselves came from diverse backgrounds, united by their assignment to Transportation Corps units. Many were draftees who had received basic truck driving training but limited preparation for the demands they would face. Others were volunteers who had civilian experience driving trucks. Some had never driven a truck before entering the Army. Private First Class George Lewis of the 3639th Quartermaster Truck Company kept a journal during his Red Ball service, later deposited in the National Archives. His entries provide a first-hand account of the experience. On August 28th, he wrote about his first Red Ball run. Drove 19 hours straight. Eyes burning from dust and lack of sleep. Twice nearly drove off the road when exhaustion overcame me. The sergeant says we must keep moving because the frontline troops are depending on us. We carry ammunition today. Tomorrow, perhaps fuel. The day after, food. It never stops. Lewis's journal documents the physical toll. Drivers developed chronic back pain from sitting in truck cabs with minimal suspension systems. Hands cramped from gripping steering wheels for hours. Eyes became irritated from dust and strain. Many drivers suffered from recurring gastrointestinal problems due to irregular meals and poor quality field rations, consumed while driving. The psychological stress was equally demanding. Drivers knew that mechanical breakdown or serious accident could be attributed to negligence, potentially resulting in court-martial. The pressure to maintain schedule was constant. Officers monitored delivery times and questioned drivers who took longer than expected. The fear of falling asleep and causing an accident haunted every driver during the late-night hours. Yet the drivers also took pride in their mission. They understood that their trucks carried the supplies that allowed the armies to advance. When ammunition reached artillery units just before a barrage, when fuel arrived as tanks prepared for an attack, when food prevented troops from going hungry, the Red Ball drivers knew they had contributed directly to the war effort. Race relations within the Red Ball units were complex. The transportation corps was segregated, with African American drivers typically serving under white officers. Some officers were respected for their fairness and competence. Others were resented for racial prejudice or incompetence. The drivers themselves formed tight bonds regardless of race when assigned to integrated companies, united by shared hardship. The statistics of Red Ball operations are staggering. During its 82 days of operation, the Red Ball Express moved 412,193 tons of supplies. This required approximately 140,000 truck trips over roads covering 782,509 miles of total travel. At peak operation in early September, nearly 6,000 trucks were operating on Red Ball routes, carrying 12,500 tons per day. But these numbers obscured the human cost. At least 75 drivers were killed in accidents during Red Ball operations. Several hundred more were seriously injured. Thousands suffered less severe injuries or chronic health problems from the demanding conditions. The transportation corps treated these losses as acceptable in the context of the larger war effort, though from the perspective of the individual drivers and their families, the cost was deeply personal. The logistical challenge of the Red Ball itself required extensive supporting infrastructure. Fuel had to be pre-positioned at refueling points along the routes. Spare parts had to be stockpiled at maintenance points. Tires had to be manufactured, shipped from America, distributed to exchange points and recapped when worn. Food for the drivers had to be prepared and delivered to rest stops. Medical personnel had to be available at aid stations. The command and control system evolved rapidly as problems emerged. Initially, truck dispatching was haphazard, with units sending trucks whenever they loaded them. This created uneven traffic flow, with periods of congestion alternating with periods when routes were nearly empty. The transportation corps instituted scheduled convoy departures, grouping trucks into formations that traveled together under the control of convoy commanders. These convoys typically included 20 to 40 trucks traveling in a column with designated spacing. The convoy commander, usually a lieutenant or captain, would ride in a jeep at the head of the column, responsible for navigation, maintaining speed, and coordinating with military police at control points. A maintenance sergeant would follow in a truck equipped with tools and spare parts, ready to make emergency repairs. Convoy discipline was essential but difficult to maintain. Drivers became frustrated when forced to travel at the pace of the slowest truck. Some would break formation to pass or take shortcuts, creating safety hazards and complicating traffic control. Officers instituted strict penalties for unauthorized breakouts, including possible reduction in rank or confinement. The operational tempo strained not just vehicles and drivers but the entire organizational structure. Company clerks worked around the clock processing dispatch orders, maintenance records, and supply requisitions. Mess sergeants prepared meals at odd hours to accommodate drivers arriving at unpredictable times. Motor pool sergeants struggled to keep sufficient vehicles operational to meet dispatch requirements. The Red Ball's end came not because the operation failed, but because it succeeded so well that it became unnecessary. By November 1944, railway operations had expanded sufficiently to handle most long-distance supply transportation. The ports of Antwerp and Le Havre were operating, reducing the distance from ports to front lines. The front itself had stabilized as the Allies prepared for winter operations. On November 16, 1944, the Red Ball Express made its final runs. The routes were open to normal military traffic. The dedicated truck companies were reassigned to other duties, though most continued in supply transportation roles. The infrastructure of fuel points, maintenance facilities, and control points was dismantled or transferred to other uses. The legacy of the Red Ball Express extended far beyond its specific accomplishments. It demonstrated that determination and improvisation could overcome seemingly impossible logistics challenges. It proved that African American soldiers could perform demanding duties with the same competence as their white counterparts, providing ammunition for those arguing for military integration. It validated the hidden logistics miracle that fed an army from Normandy to Berlin. To understand why Patton's Third Army ran out of fuel in early September 1944, we must examine the specific mathematics of fuel consumption and distribution during rapid advances. The crisis resulted not from any single failure, but from the compound effects of multiple factors that converged simultaneously. Patton's Third Army became operational on August 1, 1944. Within days, it broke through German lines at Avranches and began the exploitation phase that would carry American forces across France. The army consisted of 4 corps, each containing multiple divisions of infantry, armor, and supporting units. At peak strength, Third Army fielded approximately 250,000 soldiers, operating over 1,500 tanks, 3,000 artillery pieces, and 15,000 vehicles of various types. The fuel requirement for this force was staggering. Each M4 Sherman tank consumed approximately 1 gallon of gasoline for every 2 miles traveled. An armored division with 186 tanks moving 50 miles in a day consumed 4,650 gallons just for tank movement before accounting for the fuel used by half-tracks, trucks, jeeps, and other vehicles. When these additional vehicles were included, an armored division consumed approximately 60,000 gallons per day during mobile operations. Third Army's 4 armored divisions alone consumed 240,000 gallons per day. The infantry divisions, while less fuel-intensive, still required approximately 25,000 gallons per day, each for their organic vehicles. Artillery battalions consumed fuel for their prime movers. Support units consumed fuel for supply trucks, ambulances, and administrative vehicles. The total requirement approached 400,000 gallons per day when Third Army was advancing rapidly. The supply system simply could not deliver this quantity of fuel over distances exceeding 400 miles. Each gallon of fuel delivered to Third Army required transporting it from Normandy beaches to forward dumps. A tanker truck carrying 2,500 gallons consumed approximately 200 gallons on an 800-mile round trip. This meant 8% of the fuel capacity was consumed in transportation. At longer distances, this percentage increased dramatically. The supply system simply could not deliver this quantity of fuel over distances exceeding 400 miles. Each gallon of fuel delivered to Third Army required transporting it from Normandy beaches to forward dumps. A tanker truck carrying 2,500 gallons consumed approximately 200 gallons on an 800-mile round trip. This meant 8% of the fuel capacity was consumed in transportation. At longer distances, this percentage increased dramatically. Moreover, the tanker trucks themselves were in short supply. The transportation corps had allocated truck assets based on the planned advance schedule, which anticipated Third Army being perhaps 200 miles from the beaches in early September. Instead, Patton's forces were more than 400 miles from the beaches by late August. The trucks assigned to Third Army were making runs that took 3 times as long as planned, effectively reducing available transportation capacity by 2/3. The situation was exacerbated by competing demands. The First Army was also advancing and required fuel. The Ninth Army was being activated and needed supplies. The British and Canadian armies were pushing toward Belgium and Holland with their own logistics requirements. The port of Cherbourg, still the primary source of fuel supplies, had limited throughput capacity. Not enough fuel was arriving to satisfy all demands simultaneously. The allocation system prioritized armies based on Eisenhower's strategy. In late August, First Army received priority because it was fighting to close the Falaise Gap, attempting to trap German forces retreating from Normandy. This allocation was tactically sound but meant Third Army's fuel deliveries were reduced just as its advance accelerated. Patton's response to the fuel shortage revealed both his tactical genius and his willingness to operate outside normal channels. He ordered his army to capture German fuel stocks wherever they could be found. Third Army units overran several German fuel dumps during their advance, acquiring thousands of gallons of gasoline. This captured fuel, while helpful, was insufficient to sustain operations. Patton also used personal connections to obtain additional fuel allocations. He telephoned Eisenhower directly, arguing that Third Army was on the verge of breakthrough and needed only enough fuel to continue the advance for a few more days. He contacted Bradley, the 12th Army Group commander, making similar arguments. He even sent his logistics officer, Colonel Walter J. Muller, to personally plead Third Army's case at Shaef headquarters. These efforts produced temporary increases in fuel allocation, but could not overcome the fundamental mathematical problem. The supply system had reached its maximum capacity. No amount of arguing or personal appeals could conjure additional trucks, additional fuel stocks, or shorter distances. On August 28, Third Army received 32,000 gallons of fuel, approximately 8% of its daily requirement. On August 29, the allocation increased to 50,000 gallons, still grossly insufficient. On August 30, Patton ordered all non-essential vehicle movement to cease. Administrative vehicles were parked. Supply trucks made only critical deliveries. Even reconnaissance patrols were curtailed to conserve fuel. On August 31, Third Army's forward elements reached the Meuse River, just 70 miles from the German frontier. Reconnaissance patrols reported that German defenses along the Siegfried Line were incomplete and thinly manned. Patton believed that with adequate fuel, his army could break through and advance deep into Germany before the Germans could organize effective resistance. But Third Army had approximately 31,000 gallons of fuel remaining in its forward dumps, enough for perhaps 6 hours of mobile operations. Patton faced an impossible choice: use that fuel for a final push toward Germany, hoping that momentum would carry his forces through and that supplies would catch up, or halt and wait for the logistics system to rebuild supply stocks. The decision was not actually Patton's to make. Bradley, as Army Group Commander, had authority over supply allocations. On September 2, Bradley ordered Third Army to halt offensive operations until the supply situation improved. Patton complied, though his diary entries from this period reveal his frustration. He believed the war could have been ended in 1944 if only the fuel had been available. The halt was not total. Third Army units continued patrolling, maintaining contact with German forces and consolidating positions. But the sweeping advances of August ceased. The tanks that had covered 400 miles in 26 days sat immobile, their fuel tanks empty or nearly so. The consequences of this halt remain debated by historians. Patton argued then, and supporters argue now, that the opportunity to end the war in 1944 was lost due to timid logistics planning and Eisenhower's refusal to prioritize Third Army. The counter-argument holds that Third Army, even with adequate fuel, could not have sustained itself deep in Germany without infantry support, adequate ammunition, and secure supply lines. A rapid advance might have created a salient that German forces could have cut off, potentially destroying Third Army in a catastrophic defeat. We cannot know what might have occurred because the logistics situation made any large-scale advance impossible. What we can document is how the fuel crisis was eventually resolved and what lessons it provided for subsequent operations. The immediate response involved 3 parallel efforts. First, the Transportation Corps diverted additional truck companies to Third Army support, reducing allocations to other armies. This allowed Third Army's fuel deliveries to increase from 50,000 gallons per day in late August to over 150,000 gallons per day by mid-September. Second, engineers worked to establish forward fuel dumps closer to Third Army positions. Rather than hauling fuel all the way from Normandy, fuel was transported to intermediate dumps at Chartres and Orléans, then distributed forward in shorter hauls. This reduced the distance trucks traveled, effectively increasing the transportation system's capacity. Third, and most importantly, efforts intensified to restore railway operations and open additional ports. Railways could move fuel far more efficiently than trucks. A single freight train could carry 100,000 gallons of fuel, equivalent to 40 tanker trucks, while consuming perhaps 1/10 the fuel per gallon delivered. Opening ports closer to the front lines would reduce transportation distances dramatically. The fuel crisis prompted fundamental changes in logistics planning. The Transportation Corps revised its allocation procedures, establishing clearer priorities and more flexible response mechanisms. Fuel reserves were built at multiple echelons, providing buffers against temporary shortages. Most significantly, railway rehabilitation received increased priority and resources. The petroleum supply system itself underwent modification. Engineers began constructing pipelines from Cherbourg toward the interior. These pipelines, designated the minor system and the major system depending on their capacity, would eventually deliver millions of gallons directly to forward areas without requiring truck transportation. But pipeline construction takes time. The pipelines would not become operational until late 1944 and early 1945, too late to prevent the fuel crisis, but valuable for subsequent operations. The crisis also influenced strategic planning. Eisenhower's decision to maintain a broad front advance rather than concentrating resources on a single thrust was partly driven by logistics constraints. The supply system could not support one army advancing rapidly deep into Germany while maintaining security along a wide front. A broad front advance, while slower, spread the logistics burden across multiple supply routes and reduced the risk of any single army outrunning its support. By mid-September, Third Army had rebuilt its fuel stocks sufficiently to resume limited offensive operations. The army captured the fortresses of Metz and Nancy, crossing the Moselle River and establishing positions along the German frontier. But the sweeping advances of August did not resume. The autumn of 1944 would see methodical advances measured in miles per week rather than miles per day, partly due to stiffening German resistance but also due to logistics constraints that prevented the sustained rapid operations Patton favored. The fuel crisis of late August and early September 1944 exemplifies the fundamental reality of modern warfare. Tactics, strategy, and courage matter enormously, but logistics determines what is possible. The finest tank commander in the world cannot advance if his tanks have no fuel. The most aggressive infantry assault fails if soldiers lack ammunition. The best planned offensive collapses if supplies do not reach the troops. Patton understood this intellectually, but emotionally he struggled to accept that his army had been halted not by enemy action but by mathematics and distance. In his diary on September 3, he wrote, "My men would rather eat their belts than stop advancing. We could be in Berlin by Christmas if the fuel would just arrive. Instead we sit idle while the enemy rebuilds his defenses. This is a war that will be won by quartermasters, not by cavalrymen." He was more correct than he probably appreciated. The war would indeed be won by quartermasters, by transportation officers, by railway engineers, by port operators, and by the thousands of soldiers who perform the unglamorous but absolutely essential work of moving supplies from ships to combat units. The fuel crisis and the broader logistics problems facing the Allies by September 1944 had one clear solution: open the port of Antwerp and the Scheldt estuary leading to it. Antwerp, located in Belgium approximately 50 miles inland from the North Sea, was Europe's second-largest port before the war. Its facilities could handle dozens of large cargo ships simultaneously. Its warehouses could store enormous quantities of supplies. Its rail connections reached throughout Belgium, France, and Germany. And most importantly for Allied planning, Antwerp was only 200 miles from the German frontier, less than half the distance from Normandy beaches to the front lines. British forces captured the city of Antwerp on September 4, 1944. The capture was almost anticlimactic. German forces withdrew before British armor arrived, executing demolitions on some facilities but leaving much of the port infrastructure intact. British tankers from the 11th Armored Division drove through the streets of Antwerp with Belgian civilians cheering and waving flags. Within hours, British engineers were inspecting the port facilities and reporting to headquarters that the docks, cranes, and warehouses were largely undamaged. The initial assessment suggested Antwerp could be operational within weeks, potentially solving the Allied logistics crisis. Staff officers began planning for convoy routes from Britain to Antwerp. The transportation corps calculated how quickly supplies could reach forward areas if Antwerp was handling 40,000 tons per day. The petroleum pipeline engineers designed routes for fuel lines running from Antwerp to the front. The mood at SHAEF headquarters briefly turned optimistic. Then reality intruded in the form of geography and military necessity. Antwerp sits 50 miles inland from the North Sea, accessed via the Scheldt estuary, a waterway varying from 2 to 10 miles wide. Both banks of the Scheldt were occupied by German forces. The northern bank, part of the Netherlands, was held by the German 15th Army. The southern bank and several fortified islands in the estuary were held by German units that had withdrawn from Belgium and northern France. These German forces controlled the approaches to Antwerp completely. They had artillery positions on both banks capable of engaging any ship attempting to navigate the Scheldt. They had flooded large areas of the surrounding countryside, creating water barriers that channelized any ground attack. They had fortified villages, bunkers, and strong points throughout the region. And they were under explicit orders from Hitler himself to hold the Scheldt, approaches and deny Antwerp to the Allies for as long as possible. Hitler understood that losing Antwerp would cripple the German defensive effort. His armies were retreating toward Germany, attempting to establish defensive positions along the Siegfried Line and the Rhine River. They desperately needed time to reorganize, to bring up reinforcements, to construct fortifications. As long as Allied logistics remained strained, the advance would be slow, giving German forces the time they needed. If Antwerp opened and began supplying Allied armies efficiently, the advance would accelerate and Germany's defensive strategy would collapse. Therefore, Hitler personally designated the Scheldt fortifications as a vital fortress area. The commanders responsible for these positions were ordered to hold indefinitely. Retreat was forbidden. Surrender was unthinkable. The garrison was promised reinforcements, supplies, and air support, though these promises proved largely empty. The Allied command initially failed to recognize the full implications of the Scheldt situation. Montgomery, commanding 21st Army Group, focused on Operation Market Garden, the ambitious airborne operation intended to seize bridges across the Rhine and enable a thrust into northern Germany. Market Garden received priority for resources, attention, and planning effort through September. The Scheldt campaign was assigned to the Canadian First Army under Lieutenant General Harry Crerar. The Canadians had distinguished themselves throughout the campaign in France, fighting effectively in difficult conditions. But the Scheldt presented challenges unlike anything they had faced previously. The terrain was appalling for military operations. Much of the region consisted of polders, agricultural land below sea level protected by dikes. When German engineers opened sluice gates and breached dikes, seawater flooded these polders, creating shallow lakes interspersed with narrow strips of dry land. Infantry had to advance along exposed dikes and causeways, perfect targets for German defenders. Armor could not maneuver off the roads without becoming hopelessly bogged. The weather deteriorated as autumn advanced. Rain became frequent, turning unpaved roads into muddy tracks. Fog limited visibility and grounded aircraft that might have provided support. Temperatures dropped, making the wet conditions even more miserable for soldiers advancing through flooded terrain. The German defenders were determined and well prepared. Many were veterans of the Eastern Front who had experience in defensive operations. They had established interlocking fields of fire covering the approach routes. They had pre-registered artillery concentrations on choke points. They had stockpiled ammunition and supplies for a sustained defense. The Scheldt campaign officially began on October 2, 1944, nearly a month after Antwerp's capture. The delay resulted partly from Market Garden's priority and partly from the time required to assemble forces and supplies for the offensive. The campaign would last until November 8, involving some of the hardest fighting of the entire Northwest Europe campaign. The Canadian 2nd Infantry Division received the mission of clearing the southern bank of the Scheldt and capturing the Beveland Peninsula. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division would cross the Leopold Canal and advance northward, securing the southern approaches. The Polish 1st Armored Division would attack eastward, cutting off German forces on the southern bank. The advance began with an artillery bombardment that consumed thousands of shells. Then infantry companies moved forward, wading through waist-deep water in some sectors, advancing along narrow dikes in others. German machine guns and mortar opened fire from concealed positions. Casualties mounted rapidly. The village of Woensdrecht became the site of prolonged fighting. Located on a narrow isthmus connecting the Beveland Peninsula to the mainland, Woensdrecht was a natural choke point that the Germans fortified heavily. The Black Watch Regiment of Canada attacked repeatedly, suffering severe casualties for minimal gains. The Calgary Highlanders took over the assault, making small advances at high cost. The fighting lasted nearly 2 weeks before Woensdrecht finally fell on October 16. The Leopold Canal crossing, executed by the 7th Canadian Infantry Brigade on October 6, exemplified the challenges facing the attackers. The canal was approximately 100 feet wide with steep banks. German defenders occupied fortified positions on the far bank with clear fields of fire across the canal. The Canadians brought up assault boats and attempted to cross under cover of smoke and artillery fire. German machine guns opened fire as soon as the first boats entered the water. Many were hit and sank, their occupants drowning or dying from gunfire. Those boats that reached the far bank faced soldiers trying to climb the steep bank while under fire from close range. The initial assault was repulsed with heavy casualties. Subsequent attacks over the following days gradually established a foothold, then expanded it through bitter close-quarters combat. The Breskens Pocket, a German-held region on the southern bank of the Scheldt, required systematic reduction through a series of attacks by the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division and the 4th Canadian Armoured Division. Each village and strongpoint had to be attacked individually. German defenders frequently counterattacked to retake lost positions. The fighting was slow, methodical, and costly. Walcheren Island, controlling the northern bank of the Scheldt's mouth, presented unique challenges. The island was heavily fortified with coastal batteries, anti-aircraft positions, and infantry strongpoints. Most of the island consisted of polders below sea level, protected by a system of dikes. The Allies conceived a plan to breach the dikes and flood the island, forcing German defenders into exposed positions around the perimeter. On October 3rd, RAF Bomber Command attacked the dikes at Westkapelle, Flushing, and Veer with 1,270 tons of bombs. The breaches allowed seawater to flood into the interior, inundating 80% of the island within days. German defenders withdrew to the remaining dry areas, establishing defensive positions in the towns and villages. The assault on Walcheren involved naval, air, and ground forces in a coordinated operation. On November 1st, Royal Marine Commandos landed at Westkapelle under heavy fire from German coastal batteries. The support squadron eastern flank, consisting of landing craft armed with rockets and guns, provided close support, dueling with the German batteries at point-blank range. Several landing craft were sunk, but the commandos established a beachhead and began advancing inland through the flooded terrain. Simultaneously, other commando units attacked Flushing and the Walcheren Causeway connecting the island to the mainland. The fighting was intense, with room-to-room combat in urban areas and desperate struggles for control of dikes and high ground in flooded regions. By November 8th, organized German resistance in the Scheldt region had ended. The Canadians and their British and Polish allies had captured or killed most of the German garrison, estimated at approximately 41,000 troops. But the victory came at tremendous cost. Canadian casualties in the Scheldt campaign exceeded 12,873, including 2,077 killed. British losses added another 8,000 casualties. The toll reflected the difficulty of the terrain, the determination of the defenders, and the fundamental challenges of offensive operations in such conditions. The capture of the Scheldt approaches did not immediately open Antwerp to shipping. The Germans had extensively mined the estuary, laying approximately 267 sea mines in the shipping channels. Royal Navy minesweepers had to systematically clear these mines, a dangerous and time-consuming process that required specialized equipment and techniques. The minesweepers worked through November, gradually clearing safe channels. On November 28, 1944, nearly 3 months after British forces captured Antwerp itself, the first Allied convoy sailed up the Scheldt. The ships carried desperately needed supplies that would transform the Allied logistics situation. Within days, the port was handling thousands of tons of cargo daily. By the end of December, Antwerp was unloading over 20,000 tons per day, roughly equal to the combined capacity of all other Allied ports in northern France. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Truck convoys no longer had to drive 450 miles from Normandy beaches. Instead, they drove 200 miles from Antwerp, effectively doubling the transportation system's capacity. Railways could deliver supplies directly from Antwerp to forward dumps, conserving truck assets for shorter hauls. Fuel pipelines were constructed from Antwerp to the front lines, reducing the burden on tanker trucks. The strategic consequences were profound. The Allied advance, which had slowed to a crawl in October and early November due to supply constraints, could now resume with adequate logistics support. The armies had time during the Scheldt campaign to build up ammunition stocks, repair vehicles, rest worn-out units, and prepare for renewed offensives. When operations resumed, they would be properly supplied rather than starved for essentials. The Scheldt campaign remains one of the least remembered major operations of World War II, overshadowed by more dramatic events like Market Garden and the subsequent Battle of the Bulge. But in terms of its impact on the war's outcome, the opening of Antwerp ranks among the most important achievements of the entire Northwest Europe campaign. Without Antwerp, the Allied advance into Germany would have been impossible. With Antwerp, the logistics foundation existed to support the final victorious campaigns of 1945. While the Red Ball Express captured public imagination and the opening of Antwerp solved critical bottlenecks, the real key to sustaining Allied armies for the final drive into Germany was the rehabilitation of the French. Belgian, and eventually German railway systems. Railways could move far more cargo than trucks while consuming dramatically less fuel per ton-mile. A single freight train could carry 1,000 tons of supplies, equivalent to 200 truck trips, while consuming perhaps 2,000 gallons of fuel compared to the 26,000 gallons those trucks would require. The challenge was that the Allied strategic bombing campaign had been extraordinarily successful in destroying the French railway network. Before D-Day, Allied air forces flew thousands of sorties against railway targets as part of the transportation plan. The objective was to prevent German reinforcements from reaching Normandy by rendering the railways unusable. Bridges, marshalling yards, locomotives, repair facilities, and signal systems were systematically attacked. The results exceeded expectations. By June 6, 1944, the French railway network was essentially non-functional. The SNCF, France's National Railway, reported that approximately 1,500 locomotives had been destroyed or damaged, leaving only a few hundred operational. Over 2,000 bridges were down. Major marshalling yards were cratered wastelands. Railway workshops capable of performing repairs were demolished. Even signal systems and switching equipment were destroyed. This success created an enormous problem for Allied logistics once the breakout from Normandy began. The railways that would have provided the most efficient means of moving supplies were completely unusable. Repairing them would require a massive effort by specialized engineering units working under difficult conditions. The U.S. Army's Military Railway Service, MRS, was responsible for operating and maintaining railways in the American sector. This organization consisted of approximately 40,000 soldiers trained in railway operations, including locomotive engineers, track maintenance crews, bridge builders, signal specialists, and mechanical personnel. Many were recruited from civilian railway employment and received military training that emphasized combat support skills while leveraging their specialized knowledge. The 703rd Railway Grand Division, commanded by Brigadier General Carl R. Gray, Jr., arrived in France shortly after D-Day. General Gray had been president of the Union Pacific Railroad before the war, bringing extensive civilian experience to military railway operations. His staff included other former railroad executives, engineers, and operations managers who understood both the technical requirements and the organizational challenges of running a large railway system. The first priority was establishing a rail line from Cherbourg toward the interior. Engineers examined the tracks and found them in terrible condition. The main line east from Cherbourg had 14 destroyed bridges in the first 50 miles. The tracks themselves had been torn up in many locations. Signal systems were inoperable. Stations and switching yards were damaged. The 340th Engineer General Service Regiment received the mission of restoring this line. They began by repairing the easiest bridges using prefabricated steel spans that had been shipped from America. These spans, typically 40 to 60 feet long, could be erected by crane in a matter of days compared to the months required to construct a permanent bridge. The spans were designed to carry railway loading, though with weight and speed restrictions. Longer bridges required more extensive work. The Via River Bridge, with a span of 200 feet, could not be repaired with prefabricated components. Engineers designed a temporary timber trestle that would support light locomotives until a permanent replacement could be built. Civilian workers, hired from the local French population, provided labor while Army engineers supervised and operated heavy equipment. Track repair involved inspecting every mile of line, identifying damage, and making repairs. In some sections, the tracks had been merely damaged by bombing and could be straightened and spiked back in place. In other sections, the rails were so twisted that they had to be cut out and replaced with new rails shipped from Britain or America. Ties were often rotten or destroyed and required replacement. The pace of repair was staggering. Working around the clock, engineer units were repairing 5 to 10 miles of track per day, once they established an efficient procedure. Specialized track-laying machines, essentially railway cars equipped with cranes and tools, could lift damaged rails, replace ties, and spike down new rail in a continuous operation that advanced along the line as work progressed. By late July 1944, the first train ran from Cherbourg to Corentin, a distance of approximately 25 miles. This line immediately began carrying supplies that would otherwise have required truck transportation. The tonnage was initially modest, perhaps 500 tons per day, but it provided proof that railway rehabilitation was feasible and valuable. The railway operating procedures were adapted to war conditions. Trains ran without fixed schedules, departing when loaded and proceeding toward their destination at whatever speed the track condition allowed. Most lines operated under timetable and train order rules similar to American practice, with train movements controlled by written orders rather than signal systems. This worked adequately given the relatively low traffic density during the initial period. Locomotive procurement presented its own challenges. The surviving French locomotives were mostly incompatible with American railway practice. French railways used different coupling systems, brake standards, and loading gauges. The MRS decided to operate using American locomotives shipped from the United States. The S-160 class locomotive, specifically designed for wartime services, became the standard power for American military railways. The S-160 was a simple, rugged 280 design that could burn either coal or oil, operate on almost any track, and be maintained with minimal tools and facilities. The War Production Board ordered 2,120 S-160 locomotives from 3 manufacturers. These began arriving in France in August 1944, shipped aboard cargo vessels, and unloaded at the ports. Each locomotive required several hours of preparation after arrival, including filling with fuel and water, lubricating bearings, and conducting operational tests before it could enter service. Freight cars were similarly shipped from America. Standard 40-foot boxcars and 50-ton gondola cars arrived in large numbers, supplementing French rolling stock that could be repaired and returned to service. The Americans also brought specialized cars, including tank cars for fuel, refrigerated cars for perishables, and flat cars for hauling vehicles and heavy equipment. By September 1944, the MRS was operating approximately 1,200 miles of railway in France, carrying roughly 20,000 tons of supplies per day. This represented perhaps 30% of the total supply tonnage moving to the armies, with trucks still handling the majority. But the trend was clear. As more lines reopened, railway capacity would expand and trucks could be diverted to shorter hauls where they were more efficient. The advance across France in August and September created both opportunities and challenges for railway rehabilitation. Each mile of territory liberated potentially added railway miles that could be restored. But the rapid advance meant supply lines were stretching faster than railway repair could follow. The MRS found itself continuously extending lines forward while also maintaining rear area operations. The Paris rail complex received intensive attention once the city was liberated on August 25th. Paris was the hub of the French rail network, with lines radiating in all directions. Restoring service through Paris would enable supplies to flow to multiple armies simultaneously. The challenge was that Paris's rail facilities had been heavily bombed, and the Germans had demolished key installations before withdrawing. The Gare de l'Est, the station handling eastbound traffic, was partially destroyed. The massive glass train shed had collapsed from bomb damage. Platforms were cratered. The switching yard was full of destroyed rolling stock. Engineers spent weeks clearing wreckage, repairing tracks, and restoring basic functionality. By mid-September, trains were operating through Paris, though at reduced capacity compared to pre-war operations. The advance into Belgium brought similar challenges. Belgian railways used different technical standards than French railways, requiring American locomotives and cars to be modified or replaced. The Belgians had maintained their railway system better than the French during German occupation, meaning more equipment was potentially available. But German demolitions before withdrawal had damaged key installations. The railway bridge over the Albert Canal near Liège was demolished so thoroughly that reconstruction would take months. Engineers built a temporary timber trestle alongside the destroyed bridge, supporting a single track that limited through capacity but allowed operations to resume. This pattern was repeated at dozens of locations. Destroyed permanent bridges replaced by temporary structures that allowed operations to continue while permanent reconstruction proceeded. The opening of Antwerp in late November transformed the railway situation. Antwerp had extensive rail facilities connecting to the main lines toward Germany. Once the port was operational, trains could be loaded directly from ships and dispatched toward forward areas without intermediate handling. The MRS established a major terminal at Antwerp with classification yards, locomotive servicing facilities, and supply dumps. By December 1944, the MRS was operating over 3,000 miles of railway in France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Daily tonnage had increased to over 50,000 tons, surpassing truck transportation for the first time. The railway system was now carrying the bulk of supplies from ports to army-level dumps, with trucks handling distribution from dumps to divisions and smaller units. French railway workers played an essential role in this achievement. The SNCF provided thousands of workers who had intimate knowledge of the French system. They knew where spare parts were hidden, which locomotives might be salvageable, and how to repair French equipment. Many had sabotaged German operations during the occupation and were eager to help the Allies. The MRS hired French workers as civilian employees, paying them in newly printed French francs provided by the Allied military government. The wages were modest by American standards but generous by French wartime conditions. Workers received rations, medical care, and protection, significant benefits in a country still recovering from occupation. The relationship between American military railway personnel and French civilian workers was generally positive. Language barriers created challenges, resolved through interpreters and simple technical communication that transcended language. The shared goal of defeating Germany and liberating France created common purpose. There were tensions and disagreements, particularly regarding procedures and priorities, but these were usually resolved through compromise. As winter approached, the railway system faced new challenges. Cold weather caused mechanical problems with locomotives. Snow blocked tracks and complicated switching operations. Frozen ground made bridge repair more difficult. The MRS had to adapt procedures developed in temperate conditions to winter warfare. Despite these challenges, the railway system continued expanding. Lines pushed eastward toward Germany, following the advancing armies. By February 1945, American military railways were operating in Germany itself, taking over German railway facilities as they were captured. The captured German railways were in better condition than French and Belgian lines had been, largely because the Allies had not bombed German railways as systematically until later in the war. The final phase of railway operations involved integrating captured German infrastructure. German railways used different technical standards, including different loading gauges and electrical systems for some lines. The Americans continued using their own locomotives and rolling stock while gradually incorporating German equipment that could be modified to American practice. The statistics of the railway rehabilitation effort are remarkable. From June 1944 to May 1945, American military railways in Europe carried over 30 million tons of supplies. They operated over 6,000 miles of line at peak. They employed over 40,000 American military personnel and over 100,000 French, Belgian, and German civilian workers. They repaired or rebuilt over 2,400 bridges. They restored thousands of miles of damaged track. They maintained and operated over 2,000 locomotives and 50,000 freight cars. This achievement did not come without cost. Railway operations were dangerous even without enemy action. Switching accidents killed or injured workers. Derailments caused casualties and damaged equipment. Collisions occurred despite safety procedures. Enemy action added to the toll. German aircraft occasionally strafed or bombed trains. Artillery fired on rail lines near the front. Mines and sabotage caused derailments and explosions. The MRS lost over 200 soldiers killed in railway operations during the Northwest Europe campaign. Hundreds more were seriously injured. French and Belgian civilian workers suffered similar casualties. These losses were accepted as the price of maintaining the supply system that enabled Allied victory. The legacy of the military railway operations extended beyond the immediate war. The techniques developed for rapid bridge construction influenced post-war engineering. The organizational methods for managing large-scale railway operations under difficult conditions inform civilian railway practice. The experience of coordinating international railway systems contributed to the development of post-war European railway integration. For the Allied armies advancing into Germany in 1945, the railways provided the logistics foundation that made sustained operations possible. Without the railways, the advance would have halted at the German frontier. With the railways functioning efficiently, the armies had the supplies, ammunition, and fuel needed to complete the defeat of Nazi Germany. By December 1944, the Allied logistics system had finally achieved a relative state of equilibrium. Antwerp was operational, providing a major port close to the front lines. The railway network was functioning efficiently, carrying the bulk of supplies from ports to forward areas. Truck transportation had been optimized, with vehicles focusing on short hauls where they were most effective. Supply stocks at army depots were adequate, if not abundant. The crisis of August and September seemed to have been overcome. Then nature and the enemy combined to create a new emergency that tested the logistics system more severely than anything experienced to that point. The winter of 1940-45 was one of the coldest and snowiest in European history. Temperatures across the Ardennes region, where American forces held a thinly defended sector of the front, dropped to well below 0 Fahrenheit. Snow fell heavily and continuously, accumulating to depths of 2 feet or more. Roads became impassable without continuous plowing, rivers froze. Visibility was frequently reduced to yards by blowing snow and fog. For logistics operations, winter weather created multiple challenges. Trucks struggled on icy roads. Tire chains helped but reduced speed and increased tire wear. Engines required special cold weather lubricants and additives to prevent fuel from gelling. The concept of artificial harbors was not entirely new to military history. Naval forces had constructed temporary facilities for centuries. What made the Mulberry harbors different was their scale, sophistication, and the speed with which they had to be deployed under hostile conditions. The planning began in 1942, more than 2 years before D-Day. British military planners understood that any invasion of France would require enormous quantities of supplies landed directly onto hostile beaches until major ports could be captured and repaired. The tidal range along the Normandy coast varies by up to 20 feet, creating extreme challenges for any landing operation. A ship that docks at high tide finds itself resting on beach sand 6 hours later when the tide recedes. Conversely, cargo vehicles that drive onto the beach at low tide can be cut off when the tide rises. The solution required solving multiple engineering challenges simultaneously. First, create breakwaters that would protect an inner harbor from the Atlantic swells that make the Normandy coast notoriously rough. Second, design floating piers that could rise and fall with the tide while remaining connected to the shore. Third, develop roadways that could flex with tidal movement while supporting heavy vehicle traffic. And accomplish all of this with components that could be built in Britain, towed across the English Channel and assembled rapidly under potential enemy fire. The breakwater problem received the most attention because without protected water, nothing else would work. Naval architects designed a 3-layer system that would absorb wave energy progressively. The outermost layer consisted of old ships that would be deliberately sunk to form a barrier. These vessels, designated corncobs in Allied planning documents, would bear the brunt of Atlantic waves. Behind them, massive concrete structures called Phoenix caissons would provide the primary breakwater. Inside this double barrier, smaller bombarded floating breakwaters would dampen any remaining wave action. The corncob ships deserve examination first because their selection and preparation reveals how desperate the Allies were for any solution that might work. The British and Americans gathered 70 obsolete vessels from commercial and naval sources. These included old cargo ships, worn-out battleships, and even a few captured enemy vessels. Many dated to World War I or earlier. The HMS Centurion, launched in 1911 and already obsolete during the First World War, found itself selected for one final mission 33 years after her construction. Each corncob ship had to be prepared for its final voyage. Crews removed all valuable equipment that could be salvaged. Engineers cut openings in the hulls that could be opened remotely to flood the ship quickly once in position. The vessels had to remain seaworthy enough to cross the English Channel under their own power or tow, then sink rapidly when their crews opened the scuttling valves. The Phoenix caissons represented the most ambitious engineering component of the entire Mulberry system. These were massive reinforced concrete structures designed to be built in British construction yards, floated to France, and then deliberately sunk to form a continuous breakwater. The largest Phoenix caissons measured 200 feet long, 60 feet wide, and rose 60 feet from base to top. They displaced approximately 6,000 tons when floated. Construction took place at sites around Britain, employing over 45,000 workers. The scale of the project was unprecedented. Each caisson required thousands of tons of concrete, hundreds of tons of reinforcing steel, and precision engineering to ensure they would float properly when towed and sink controllably when ballasted. The engineering challenges were formidable. The caissons had to be light enough when empty to float with sufficient freeboard for ocean towing, yet heavy enough when ballasted to resist storm waves that would assault them after positioning. Engineers designed the caissons with internal compartments that could be selectively flooded. This allowed precise control of the sinking process and enabled the caissons to be positioned with their tops at exactly the right height, above the high water mark. Anti-aircraft guns were mounted on many caissons. Recognizing that German aircraft would certainly attack these obvious targets once their purpose became clear. A total of 213 Phoenix caissons were constructed between May 1943 and June 1944. Each had to be tested, towed to a staging area, and prepared for the cross-channel voyage. The logistics of simply managing the construction program rivaled many major pre-war construction projects. Concrete had to be rationed because the caissons competed with airfield construction, fortifications, and other military projects for this critical material. The Bombardier floating breakwaters represented a different engineering approach. These were cruciform steel structures anchored in position but floating on the surface. In theory, they would rise and fall with the waves while absorbing energy through resistance. In practice, they proved less successful than the concrete caissons, but they added an additional layer of protection. Behind these breakwater systems, the harbor proper had to provide facilities for ships to dock and unload. The solution combined fixed and floating components in an integrated system that could accommodate tidal variations. Pierheads designated whales were massive floating steel structures where ships would dock. These pierheads connected to shore via flexible roadways called Swiss rolls that could articulate as the pierheads rose and fell with the tide. The Swiss rolls were themselves marvels of engineering. They consisted of steel roadway sections connected by flexible joints that allowed the roadway to curve and twist while supporting loaded trucks. Engineers had to ensure the joints were strong enough to carry military vehicles, yet flexible enough to accommodate the movement. The design went through multiple iterations before arriving at a solution that balanced these contradictory requirements. Each whale pierhead was approximately 200 feet long and 60 feet wide, essentially a floating dock. Multiple pierheads would be installed at each harbor, providing berths for several ships simultaneously. The pierheads had to be strong enough to withstand ships docking against them, stable enough to remain level despite wave action, and tall enough that their decks remained above water even at low tide. 2 complete Mulberry harbors were planned. Mulberry A would serve the American sector at Omaha Beach. Mulberry B would serve the British and Canadian sector at Arromanches. Each harbor required approximately 600,000 tons of concrete and steel for its components. The construction program represented one of the largest engineering projects undertaken during the war, comparable in scale to building multiple major naval vessels. The assembly procedure was carefully choreographed. Immediately after D-Day, tugs began towing the oldest and most expendable corncob ships across the channel. These vessels would form the outer breakwater first, providing initial protection for the more valuable Phoenix caissons. On June 7th, D-Day +1, the first corncobs were sunk in position off the invasion beaches. Crews aboard each ship opened the scuttling valves at precisely calculated positions, flooding the hulls while maintaining enough buoyancy to control their descent. The ships had to settle onto the seabed in specific orientations to maximize their effectiveness as breakwaters. Naval architects had calculated optimal spacings and overlaps to ensure the line of sunken ships, created a continuous barrier without gaps where waves could penetrate. The Phoenix caissons followed over the next several days. Each had to be towed approximately 100 miles from British ports to the Normandy coast, a voyage that took 12 to 15 hours in good weather. The towing operations were vulnerable to German submarines, aircraft, and E-boats. Naval escorts accompanied each caisson, providing protection during the crossing. Minesweepers cleared the routes repeatedly because German mine-laying continued even after D-Day. Positioning the caissons required extraordinary precision. Each had to be placed within feet of its designated location to ensure proper alignment with adjacent units. Survey teams marked positions using buoys while teams aboard the caissons controlled the flooding process. Too much ballast too quickly would cause uncontrolled sinking. Too little ballast too slowly would allow wind and current to push the caisson off position. The process took several days. By June 16th, enough caissons were in position to provide meaningful protection. Ships could anchor in the lee of the breakwaters and begin unloading more efficiently than onto the open beaches. The Mulberry harbors were becoming functional. Then nature intervened in the worst possible way. On June 19th, the worst storm to hit the English Channel in 40 years arrived without warning. Meteorologists in 1944 lacked the satellite imagery and computer models that modern forecasters rely upon. Weather observation networks were disrupted by the war. The storm appeared with little advance notice and grew quickly in intensity. Winds reached gale force. Waves built to heights exceeding 6 feet. The storm continued for 3 days, from June 19th through June 22nd. The incomplete Mulberry harbors, still being assembled, suffered catastrophic damage. Mulberry A at Omaha Beach, the American harbor, was essentially destroyed. The bombarded breakwaters broke loose from their moorings and smashed into the Phoenix caissons. Several caissons cracked and flooded uncontrollably, settling deeper than intended. The pierheads tore loose from their anchors and were driven onto the beach by wave action. Swiss roll roadways twisted and snapped. Ships that had taken shelter behind the incomplete breakwaters were driven aground. The Americans abandoned Mulberry A entirely. Engineers salvaged what components they could and transferred them to Mulberry B. The American supply operation would have to rely on direct beach landings and whatever could be unloaded through Cherbourg once that port was repaired. Mulberry B at Arromanches, the British harbor, survived the storm but suffered significant damage. Several Phoenix caissons were damaged, some bombarded units broke loose. But the core structure remained intact. Engineers made emergency repairs and resumed assembly operations. By the end of June, Mulberry B was operational again, though with reduced capacity compared to the original design. The storm's impact extended beyond physical damage. It delayed landing operations by 3 days at a critical period when Allied forces were still fighting to expand the Normandy beachhead. Thousands of tons of supplies sat aboard ships offshore, unable to be unloaded. The backlog would take weeks to clear. Despite these setbacks, the Mulberry concept proved its worth. Mulberry B at Arromanches continued operations through the autumn of 1944, eventually landing over 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies. At peak efficiency in July, the harbor was unloading 7,000 tons per day, equivalent to a medium-sized commercial port. The engineering lessons learned from Mulberry informed post-war harbor construction and military engineering. The concept of rapidly deployable temporary facilities influenced planning for future amphibious operations. During the Korean War and Vietnam War, American engineers drew on Mulberry experience when establishing logistics bases in areas lacking port infrastructure. But in the summer of 1944, the Mulberry harbors, while successful beyond what might have been expected, could not alone solve the Allied supply problem. They provided one piece of the solution, delivering supplies from ships to shore. The vastly more difficult problem remained: how to move those supplies from the beaches to the armies advancing hundreds of miles inland.